What is going on, everybody? Nathan here, and this is Celtic Productions. Now today I have another EDH deck to cover with you guys, and this time we are dabbling in the green and blue colors. So Simic is a color combination that I've always wanted to make a deck around. It's just that I've always had trouble finding enough sort of synergy to make the 1/1 counter synergy entirely worth it. And I simply had more high priority decks to make, things like Golgari, which I enjoy a lot. But this time we are covering the Simic colors, and we're going to look at some deck stats real quick before we jump into the deck here. The deck clocks in at $140, which is a little bit above the price range that I normally make for my decks. For those of you unfamiliar with sort of how I like to craft my EDH decks, I like to keep the price between $100 and $125. And the reason for this is that I think that it's definitely within the budget of an avid Magic player to sort of blow on an EDH deck. Rather than some of these EDH decks that you find online are $300, $400, $500. It's like, no, like, to me, college students are mostly what make up Magic players, whether that's MTG online or just in store. And I feel like college players do not have the budget at all to spend on a $500 deck. So that's ridiculous. So anyway, I just try to keep my decks a little bit cheaper, much more within the price range of your average Joe, so to speak. So the deck is running 27 creatures, which you know, I'd like to actually up this to maybe 31-ish creatures. I feel like that's more appropriate for Simic, which is supposed to be pretty creature heavy, but that's sort of how the deck turned out when I was crafting it. And then we have all of these other things that are going to help keep you alive, keep your creatures alive, and stuff like that. And we have 35 lands. And in the mana graph here is a little bit misleading because there are many blue cards that actually and possibly other green cards that actually are not the mana curve that Tapped Out seems to think they are. For example, Curse of the Swine, Tapped Out will record that as a 2-drop, when in reality it's probably around a 7-drop or so. Cyclonic Rift, it's going to capture that as a 2-drop. Cyclonic Rift is actually a 7-drop unless you really want to use it in an emergency. Things like Rite of Replication is a 9-drop 99% of the time. So this graph is actually very misleading, and I would recommend ignoring it almost entirely. I might actually craft a graph and maybe post it in the description to see what the actual mana curve of this deck is supposed to look like. So, but that depends on if I remember. Okay. One last thing, the color variation here is pretty much exactly how I like to make my commander decks. I always like to put in a little bit more of the secondary color that I have than I need, just to make sure that I'm not color screwed. So Simic 1/1 counters, that's what we're dealing with here. They can't handle these counters. So we're looking at 1/1 counter synergy, and Varel of the Hallclade is the absolute perfect commander to handle 1/1 counter synergy. Not only 1/1 counters, but his ability here actually targets target artifact, creature, or land, and put another one of those counters on that permanent. So you're going to cost 2 mana, tap him, and you're going to basically double the counters on a permanent you control. And that is insane, because that can combo with many other things, whether you want to make a creature massive, whether you want to if you want to double your eternity vessel, which is an artifact which you can set your life to the number of counters on it, so you can double basically your life total every time a land enters. This guy has crazy synergy. That's basically the point that I'm trying to make here. And he is the #1 commander that I recommend playing if you're looking at 1/1 counter synergy. He has 1 power, 4 toughness, which means that he is a little bit more durable and that he doesn't die immediately to a lightning bolt. But 4 toughness is still not a lot in Commander, and I would recommend playing this guy with some hexproof protection. In addition, what's nice is that he is pretty cheap here, so only 78 cents, so not some crazy $15 commander. So anyway, Varel is an amazing commander, and like I said, he is decently weak, so he's probably going to be receiving a lot of hate, and I would recommend playing him with some creature protection. So hopefully you'll have an asceticism on the field, you have maybe some Greaves or some boots on there to protect him. But we'll actually sort of handle all that stuff in a second. But I just would like to say that at the very beginning that this guy needs protection. He's a valuable tool in the deck, and you should take care of your tools. Little life lesson there. Anyway, moving on to the mana base, we have 35 lands. Not entirely as many lands as I would prefer. 36 or 37 lands is typically what I'm more comfortable with. But this deck has amazing card draw, ridiculous card draw, and card draw functions as almost pseudo land. It just makes sure that you're always hitting your land drops. So I sort of use that reasoning to justify only having 35 lands here. We have a ton of non-basic lands. You have your Terramorphic Expanses and your Evolving Wilds. Just a bunch of stuff that just gives you options with your land. Things like Blighted Woodland, Blighted Cataract. Again, just options available to you that are not mana efficient, obviously, because that's sort of how non-basic lands work. But just good stuff in general. And then there are 17 basics in case you run into non-basic land hate, which is sometimes a possibility in certain play groups. I don't do that in my play group at all, just because I feel like attacking your lands is almost sort of just a douchey thing to do in Magic. That would be kind of like Hearthstone attacking somebody's mana crystals. It's just a sort of a mean thing to do. But just in case you run into that sort of hate, we have 17 basics here to speed you along. So with our 1/1 counter synergy, we're going to move on to sort of the meat of the deck here, which is this sort of just generic creature category. But this is really just creatures that will synergize well with other cards that you have and synergize with 1/1 counter. So we'll just sort of handle this miscellaneous category first. Champion of Lamb Holt is going to be a high priority for 1/1 counters, because the more powerful he or she gets, that means that more of your creatures can be unblockable, which is insane. Unblockability is a great ability to have, so target this guy with your 1/1 counters. Clever Impersonator does not synergize with anything in particular, but it is so good in both mana value and utility that I couldn't justify not having this card in the deck. Clever Impersonator for 4 mana can net you upwards of a 6 mana drop, a 7 mana drop, or even higher. Or, again, it can be used for utility if you need to sort of maybe apply the legendary rule, or, I don't know if the legendary was actually still in effect. I think they might have changed that. I don't know off the top of my head, though. But just in case you need to also copy some ridiculous enchantment that one of your opponents has, this guy is the guy that you want to draw, which is also why he's $3. Crown Ceratok is a late game drop. This is the guy that you want to play once you have all of your creatures out. You have some 1/1 counters on them, and you're ready to do some damage. So this guy will give all your creatures with 1/1 counters trample, so that you can actually get that damage through. Elusive Crassus is going to be evolving quite a bit, which is great because he is unblockable. So for 3 mana, I think this guy has a lot of late game potential as well. It's just that you need to grow him with the evolve mechanic and also target him with other 1/1 counters. Experiment Kraj is another sort of classic Simic card. 4 power, 6 toughness, pretty tough guy, but he has all activated abilities of each creature with a 1/1 counter on it, and you can tap him to basically play or put a 1/1 counter on target creature, which will then activate his first ability. So this guy is probably going to be another late game card that you play once you have a creature with some ridiculous ability, such as a Master Biomancer, or something like Forgotten Ancient, which we'll look at in a second. But Experiment Kraj is great. He's just a nice utility card to have. Forgotten Ancient is going to net you a ton of 1/1 counters, so whenever a player casts a spell, including yourself, you may put a 1/1 counter on Forgotten Ancient, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of those 1 counters onto other creatures. What this means is that if you figure that you are in a 4-player match, including yourself, all of your opponents, I sort of average that they'll cast around 2 spells in a turn. So if you play this guy, let's say you cast another spell, so he has 1/1 counter, and then you pass the turn around to all of your opponents, this guy is still living, then he has 7 1/1 counters ready to be distributed to other creatures. So a really nice 1/1 counter engine, this guy, as long as he survives. Now, if you don't want to move 1/1 counters off of him, he can also be just a nice generic fatty, which is pretty solid as well, but I would definitely recommend putting 1/1 counters on other creatures. Kyora's Follower, 2/2 for 2, actually really good efficiency, mana efficiency there. But this card is going to be crazy because it combos with a bunch of other cards that have tap ability. So things like Experiment Kraj is sort of useful, but what Kyora's Follower really wants to target is Varel, your commander, because this tap ability right here is so insanely crazy that you want to use it twice per turn if possible. Oh, excuse me. So that's what Kyora's Follower is there to do, is to copy this ability so that, not copy, but so that you can use it twice. Master Biomancer is going to be insane. 4 cost 2/4. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional 1/1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power and is a mutant in addition to its other types. So you target this guy with 1/1 counters. He's sort of a high priority for those, so that he can basically give all of your other creatures a ton of 1/1 counters as they enter the battlefield, and that is insane, which is why he's $5. Mercfiend Liege, another classic Simic card, 5-drop 4/4, which is actually decent stats for a 5-drop, but all of your all of your other creatures you control get +1/+1. Other blue creatures you control get +1/+1. And its best ability, untap all green and or blue creatures you control during each other player's untap step. So basically, all of your creatures have vigilance, and you can go ahead and actually synergize this guy with tap abilities. So again, things like Experiment Kraj, Varel, creatures like that. Predator Ooze is an interesting card. He's actually mostly just a fun card to have. So triple green, so a little bit of expensive green mana there, but he's going to be a indestructible 1/1, and he's going to generate a whole bunch of 1/1 counters, and this guy hopefully develops into a massive fatty that your opponents can't deal with. If you suit this guy up with Hexproof, he is crazy. This guy is just really fun, even though he might not be the best card, the most valuable card per mana that you're spending, but he's definitely one of the more fun cards in the deck. Progenitor Mimic is one of those cards that doesn't synergize really well with the other deck's theme, but like Clever Impersonator, I felt that it was worth a spot because it can copy any creature on the battlefield and spawn another token of it, and keep spawning tokens of it, basically. So that's pretty crazy. So it is a 6-drop, but basically, let's at the beginning of your upkeep. Okay, so it's a 6-drop. You're going to get a copy of target creature and hope to God that the token copy ability goes off. Otherwise, you wasted some mana. But definitely a $4 card for a reason. This guy is pretty insane, which you can start copying creatures. Again, copying creatures is actually useful not only to copy your opponent's stuff, but to copy your own things. So, for example, imagine if you had 2 to 3 Forgotten Agents on the battlefield. You are generating a crazy number of 1/1 counters. That is insane. So, this guy, your own creatures make good targets to copy as well. So just keep that in mind when you're perhaps playing the deck. And Renegade Crassus is going to put a bunch of other 1/1 counters on creatures already having 1/1 counters when it evolves. So this is just good 1/1 counter synergy overall. Sapphire Drake, in a very similar style to Crown Ceratox, Sapphire Drake is going to be a late game drop. Once you have sort of some dudes with 1/1 counters on them, then you can go ahead and drop this guy and make them basically unblockable. It's not really flying, but I don't know that a lot of people run like specifically flyers in EDH. So Zamak Guildmage, a 2/2 for 2, so good mana efficiency there, but his abilities are pretty great. This turn, each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter on it. So that's going to be amazing, but you can also basically pay some mana to draw a card if you have no other use for those 1/1 counters. So that's great. This guy can keep your hand refilled in the case of an emergency. Okay, so that's sort of the basic creatures of the deck. So now we'll move on to... I suppose I should have covered ramp. I want to actually cover the rest of the creatures here, though, before we move on to anything else. So our beaters section here is going to be our big guys that have large power and toughness. Altered Ego can't be countered, and it's going to copy a target creature and enter the battlefield with X 1/1 counters, and as you can see, the X cost and the mana cost there. So again, you can go out and copy some of your own guys and have them be massive, sustainable fatties with this card right here. So Altered Ego, pretty crazy. Colognian Hydra, here's where we get into some of the more expensive cards within the deck. So that's sort of why this deck is around $140, mostly because of these Hydra cards actually right here. They synergize so well with everything else. I'm actually going to check to make sure that Audacity is recording. Okay. So Colognian Hydra, a 5-cost, enters the battlefield with 4 1/1 counters on it, trample. When it attacks, double the number of 1/1 counters on each creature you control, including Colognian Hydra. So obviously this card is $11 because it's so insane. Oh my god, this card is just crazy. This is my favorite card out of the entire deck, if I'm going to be honest, because you are doubling so many 1/1 counters, and Colognian Hydra is growing massive in the process. You know, turn 2, turn 1, you're going to be casting, or you're going to have this guy be an 8/8 trampler already, and he only costs 5 mana. That's just great. Managorger Hydra, 3-cost 1/1 trample. Whenever a player casts a spell, put a 1/1 counter on it. So this guy is basically it has some 1/1 counter synergy. It makes a great target for things like Experiment Kraj. But basically what this guy is just a fatty. He's a pretty slow fatty, but that's basically what he is. Primordial Hydra enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, double the number of 1/1 counters on him, and he has trample as long as he has 10 or more 1/1 counters on it. So this guy's going to be a target for Varel or any sort of counter doubling spell, because this guy is going to grow exponentially. So what you want to do is you want to grow him as early as possible so that he can capitalize on that exponential, just how the math works with that. So this guy is going to be a crazy fatty. Unfortunately, he will have trample. Okay, so he has trample as long as it has 10 or more 1/1 counters on it. So that's going to be great. Hopefully he'll get through for a ton of damage. Realm Seekers is going to be basically just another fatty for 6. Enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it, where X is the total number of cards in all players' hands. So on average, I would say that each player is going to have, on average, around 4 cards in their hands. So even if we'll keep that estimate even low. We'll say each player has 3. So most Commander matches involve 4 players, and 3 times 4 is obviously 12. So what you're getting is a 12-12 with 1/1 counters on it, which can, be doubled or whatever because of that 1/1 counter synergy for 6 mana. So that's really efficient fatty. And also you can pay a few some mana, remove some 1/1 counters from it, and you can search your library for some lands to guarantee that you have those land drops in the late game. Vastwood Hydra is going to basically, you are paying for the 1/1 counters on it, but then you are going to distribute all of those 1/1 counters on it to other creatures once it dies, which is great. So this card sort of just has value even after it dies, which is why it is almost an auto-include in this deck. So that's our beater category. We have 6 beaters, so that's pretty much the perfect amount of strength that we would like to have. And I guess I'll just cover the ramp section here. Ramp is pretty basic. We got our Kodama's Reach, very efficient mana ramp, or basic land ramp, actually. Soul Ring, classic Soul Ring. Solemn Simulacrum functions for some extra card draw as well, and can chump block. And then our Thought Vessel to have the maximum hand size. Okay. So we covered our creatures that we're sort of hoping to have 1/1 counters on, and we'll now focus on actually putting 1/1 counters on those creatures. So Contagion Engine is going to be pretty great. It's pretty slow, but Definitely worth it. If you have an army out, you cast this thing for 10 mana to use its ability right away. That's crazy. So when it enters the battlefield, put a 1 counter on each creature target player controls. So a little bit of token hate in there if you manage to find that useful. But you want to then double proliferate. So proliferate is where, let's see, you choose, then give each other. So, okay, so proliferate is where you take anything with a counter on it and give it another counter. So that's going to be great for, obviously, creatures with 1/1 counters. But also, if we look at, things like Eternity Vessel, things like that, Chiara, I believe planeswalkers are affected by this. Let me look. For you choose any number of permanents. Yeah, so Chiara will be a nice target for proliferate, and in general, just proliferate is pretty fantastic. And what's great about Contagion Engine is that you get to proliferate twice. Usually proliferate is worth about 4 mana, actually, and the fact that you can cast 2 proliferates for literally 4 mana with this card is pretty crazy. Death's Present is going to be 6 cost enchantment, so really expensive enchantment, vulnerable to enchantment hate, unfortunately, but its effect is fantastic. Whenever a creature you control dies, put X1 on counters on target creature you control, where X is the power of the creature that died. So this card may or may not be the best for what it is supposed to do, just because it can be removed so easily, but if anything, it's sort of like Predator Ooze. This card is way more fun than you'll find value in it. Just putting so many 1/1 counters on things that have died is a very fun idea. So I decided to keep it in the deck. Hardened Scales is kind of similar. If 1 or more 1/1 counters will be placed on a creature you control, that many plus 1 1/1 counters are placed on it instead. For 1 green, this card is definitely worth it. Increasing Savagery is going to basically just put 1/1 counters on a target creature, and you can flash it back. So basically, this card can be casted twice. I always appreciate flashback cards because it just adds in an extra option in your EDH matches. Inexorable Tide, a little bit slow, but definitely worth it in the long run if this guy can survive. So 5 cost enchantment, whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. So on average, like I said, if you cast a spell 2 turns, you're getting 2 proliferates a turn for free for the upfront mana cost of 5 mana, which is pretty great. Primal Vigor is another really expensive card. This card is basically doubling season without the permanent doubling status. So instead, this card only targets creatures rather than permanents, which is why it's not $37 like Doubling Season. By the way, Doubling Season is not in this deck simply because it is so expensive. I did not want to make this deck a $200 deck simply for 1 card. So Primal Vigor is going to double all 1/1 counters that are placed on your creatures. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This deck doesn't run a lot of token production, so that's mostly, this card is mostly just here for the 1/1 counter doubling. And Solidarity of Heroes is going to be pretty insane if you can strive a bunch of targets. So choose any number of target creatures, double the number of 1/1 counters on each of them. So sort of a one-time doubling. But the plan is to have out a bunch of creatures and then cast this on all of your creatures, making them insanely huge. So that is how you're going to have your creatures and how you're going to grow your creatures. Now, you're going to want to also protect your creatures because they are going to be receiving a lot more hate once people realize how quickly green-blue can grow your own creatures. So we have Asceticism, which is a classic green card. Basically, creatures you control can't be, well, have hexproof, and then you can regenerate your target creature, actually, or your opponents if you want to make some friends. You can make your opponent's creatures indestructible, but that's mostly going to be targeting your own creatures, and it is very clear why this card is a $9 card. Inspiring Call is going to be your red button against a board wipe. So having so much aggro, so many creatures on the board at once is going to tempt opponents into playing board wipes, and this is your key out of one of them, Inspiring Call. Plus, it is insane card draw. So right here in our category of 6 card draws, or card draw, which we have 6 of, This doesn't include things like Inspiring Call. So this category is actually a little bit bigger than you might expect it to be. But Inspiring Call does have the extra draw effect. So draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. But I mostly included it for those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn as a defense against board wipes. The classic Lightning Greaves gives something haste and Shroud, Swiftfoot Boots, haste and hexproof, and then Plax Caster Frogling, which is actually really hard to say, is going to be a 3/3 for 3, and you can go ahead and give your things hexproof, much like, wait, is it actually Shroud? Target creature... Yeah, so it's actually Shroud, but it functions similar to Asceticism, where you sort of play it. If you then cast Varel, for example, with Plax Caster Frogling on the field, you want to definitely move a 1/1 counter onto it so that this guy can protect Varel. So you can only pay 4 mana to have both of these creatures have Shroud, which is pretty amazing. Okay, so our finishers, how are you going to close out the game? Clone Legion is a classic blue card that I always like to include, simply because for, 9 mana, I still think that this card does a lot. Some people might disagree with me that it's a little bit inefficient, but I really like Clone Legion because, especially with the Simic colors, your creatures are very valuable. So whether you want to target your own creatures to put copies of them onto the field and synergize with more 1/1 counter synergy, that's up to you. Otherwise, this is also can sort of act as a defensive card. So if you are facing some ridiculous token player and they have built up their army and you're facing 40 soldiers, let's be real here, then a Clone Legion can be your key out of that, because you can neutralize their army, or at least tempt that person to not attack you, because your creatures will block their army at least once, so they might want to turn their focus elsewhere. Decree of Savagery. Of all of the cards in this deck, this would be the card that I am most hesitant about including. The reason being is that it relies upon having a ton of creatures on the board to really be the sort of finishing effect that it's supposed to. Put for 9 mana actually, at instant speed granted, but for 9 mana you're putting 4 1/1 counters on each creature you control. So ideally you have perhaps 4 creatures on the board that have 1/1 counter synergy, and you go ahead and cast Decree of Savagery, and you swing in with those creatures and wreck face. But I feel like there are so many situations in which this card just sort of sits in your hand doing nothing, where I'm sort of hesitant to include it. Fortunately, it does have the cycling ability, but the cycling ability is basically 6 mana, draw a card, and put 4 1/1 counters on target creature. That's also sort of good, but pretty mana efficient. But the good thing about that is that this card does have that secondary cycling option, if you find that it is sitting dead in your hand. So sort of a common theme that we're seeing here is utility where we need it. You know, things have a little bit, your cards here are more flexible. You know, things like you know, just having secondary abilities, for example, the flashback, just the sheer utility of the deck makes it good sort of in defensive mode in addition to offensive mode, which is something that I sort of like about this deck as well. Your ideal course of action is to build up your creatures and send them forward offensively, but if you're really losing in an EDH match, then this deck can sort of play off of play while backpedaling, so to speak. Overwhelming Stampede is going to be a finisher offensively. Until end of turn, creatures you control with gain trample and get +X/+X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So this is sort of a classic green card. I think most people are familiar with this card. This card is pretty freaking crazy. I think it's used a lot in pretty much any deck that can run green, and it's just a good finisher that way. And then Rite of Replication, you want to cast this for its kicker cost to put, is it 4 or 5? Put 5 of a copy target creature onto the battlefield. So again, this card is great if you synergize it with your own very valuable creatures. Otherwise, if you want to copy an opponent's, you know, Darksteel Colossus or whatever the hell they may be running, then that is pretty cool too. Okay, and lastly, our card draw. So what's going to keep you refueled? Well, these cards right here, in addition to some others, like I mentioned, like Inspiring Call. Fathom Mage is going to evolve, hopefully a lot for 4 mana. Whenever one encounter is placed on her, you may draw a card. So sort of a draw engine for you on the field. The problem with Fathom Mage, and this is probably the second card that I would be the most hesitant to keep in this deck, just because I feel like she's very slow. I know that other cards in here are very slow, and I wouldn't complain about them, but I feel like this card in particular, for being so slow, I feel like her effect is going to draw too much hate, where she won't be that useful, because for 4 mana, I kind of would rather draw a card up, or draw 3 cards up front using something like Harmonize or Concentrate. But hopefully you play this guy, or this girl, whatever, on a safe board where she can draw you many more cards. Illusory Ambusher, some people disagree with this card being in the deck. That's fine. I like Illusory Ambusher perfectly fine, because it is a 5 mana, potentially draw a crap ton of cards for only 5 mana. And it has the added addition of the sort of added bonus of being able to kill off one of your opponent's creatures, granted that it has toughness 4 or less, which I really like. So I'd much rather play this card than any other card that will net me 3 to 4 cards for 5 mana. This card I feel is very good just for the surprise effect. People might not expect Simic to have a lot of surprises up their sleeve because the Simic game plan is pretty straightforward most of the time, but this card is going to draw you a shitload of cards. Prime Seeker Zagana, 6-drop, 1/1. Well, that's terrible. What is its ability? Prime Seeker Zagana enters the battlefield with X1 encounters on it, where X is the greatest power among other creatures you control. Oh my god. When it enters the battlefield, draw cards equal to its power. Oh my god. So this card is your main... this will probably net you the most cards other than Recurring Insight. So let me rephrase that. This card will net you the most cards on a given turn. For 6 mana, you are basically making a fatty, and you're drawing cards from that fatty. Like, I don't see any other greater use for fatty than drawing cards off of it. I don't know. I don't even need to explain this. It's so good. Recurring Insight is a pretty classic blue card draw card. You can pretty much net, 10 cards and beyond that just with Recurring Insight for 6 mana. I can't believe this card actually isn't banned just because it's so ridiculous. Tezzert's Gambit, draw 2 cards, then proliferate. All right, 1 counter synergy and some card draw. That's great. Urban Evolution is going to be some card draw plus a little bit more ramp. So this card sort of functions as perhaps another land, perhaps just another ramp card. But the deck can use a little bit more mana acceleration, which this card covers a little bit more. What haven't we covered here? Targeted removal. We'll go over the miscellaneous last. Beast Within, another classic green card. Green removal card. This is used in tons of decks. Destroy target permanent. Its controller puts a 3/3 token onto the battlefield. Totally worth it at instant speed. Lux Cannon is going to synergize well with any sort of Varel or 1/1 counter, or not 1/1 counter, any sort of basically just Varel, actually, whatever, just puts another counter or proliferate. So put a charge counter on Lux Cannon. You can do that once per turn, and then you can tap it again to remove 3 counters from it to destroy target permanent. So I think the reason why this card is around $3, besides just being a mythic, is because it does have that counter synergy for things like Varel and stuff like that. So even when you don't have the synergy for it, though, the Lux Cannon can be pretty good on its own. It's just very slow again. And then we have 1 Pongify just for destroy target creature. Put a 3/3 token on the battlefield for that opponent. Non-creature removal. Acidic Slime, classic green card. Doesn't need much explaining. Consigned to Dust. So here's the thing. When it comes to non-creature removal, I am a fan of having cards that can target more than one artifact and enchantment, because I just feel like with Commander, you can afford to have your mana, your curve be a little bit higher, and I'd rather pay 3 more mana, for example, to net another destroyed artifact or enchantment. So Consigned to Dust is great because it has unlimited potential, whether you're in the early game, the mid game, or the late game. If you want to spend 12 mana to blow up 4 things that are really hindering you from pulling out that win, then you can go ahead and do that. Otherwise, if there's only 1 or 2 things that your opponents have that need to be dealt with, then you can handle that for less mana. Rain of Thorns is going to net you 2, well, destroy, let's see. Actually, it's going to net you all 3 because there's no reason why you would not choose all 3 of these. Destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, destroy target land. And then Relic Crush is going to net you 2 artifacts or enchantments. And for our last defense, counterspells are interesting in the Simic colors because I would include them if I knew that I was going up against more board wipes. The thing is, counterspells are mostly going to only be used in this decks to in defensive mode. It's pretty crazy sometimes when an opponent can cast an absolutely ridiculous creature, but this deck has little defense against board wipes, and I feel like because you're so the deck strategy hinges so much upon having your creatures out and growing those creatures, you definitely want to save these for board wipes in particular. So Fuel for the Cause is going to counter target spell and then proliferate, so we have someone on counter synergy, and then Plasm Capture is going to counter target spell, and you get X mana in your mana pool, where X was that spell's converted mana cost for 4 mana again. So, again, try to save your counter spells for something really defensive, to sort of to sort of negate those board wipes that might happen. And there are 2 of them, and also Inspiring Call, so a total of 3 cards which will really prevent against board wipes. And finally, our miscellaneous category here, Eternity Vessel is going to be pretty insane if this thing can actually stay on the field for a while. 6 mana, which is a lot for an artifact, but it enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it, where X is your life total, and your landfall ability is going to be whenever you play a land, you can set your life total equal to those number of charge counters. So this will combo with things like Varel. You know, if you play this with 30 counters on it, you can use Varel's ability to make that 60. All of a sudden, you have gained 30 life if you manage to pull that off with its landfall ability. Illusionist Bracers is going to copy abilities activated abilities. I'm sorry, I couldn't put that thought together. It's going to copy activated abilities. So this deck has tons of those. So you'll definitely not want for a target for Illusionist Bracers here. Chiara is going to be pretty useful. It's going to be really nice to sort of control the threats on the board. So untap up to 1 target creature and up to 1 target land. I'm sorry, untap up to 1 target creature and up to 1 target land. So you actually sort of can't really control the threats, but you can manipulate your own board to not only synergize with things like Varel or anything that has a tap ability, but also to untap perhaps a creature that swung for damage, one of your Hydras perhaps, if you want that guy back on defense, you can go ahead and use Chiara's ability in the second main phase there. Again, well, card generation, that's nothing new for Planeswalkers, and her ability is pretty crazy. Her ultimate is pretty crazy. I doubt that you actually get it off. But anyway, Cure is just a good card to include in the deck. At 4 loyalty counters immediately, for 4 mana, she's very good. And her untap synergy with Varel is pretty good too. And Krufix is going to net you a crap ton of mana. This guy should actually be in the ramp category, but I just put him in the miscellaneous because he has multiple abilities. You have no maximum hand size. Well, that's going to be good if we're drawing a shitload of cards. And he's going to have that extra ramp ability as well. Supplant Form, go ahead and bounce a target creature. Put a copy of that creature onto the battlefield. This is a pretty douchey card because it feels like you're stealing that creature, although you're really not. But just in general, for 6 mana, this card is very, very powerful. And 1,000-Year Elixir is going to be more untapped synergy for Varel. And you can also have activated abilities activate as soon as those creatures enter the battlefield, which is pretty awesome. And then Verdant Confluence is sort of does everything. So for 6 mana, you can choose any of the following 3. Put 2/1 counters on target creatures. So if you choose all 3, you get 6 1/1 counters. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So that's you have some grave recurrence there. And you can also ramp for basic lands. So that's pretty much the entire deck. Oh, so board wipes. Curse of the Swine, which is really interesting, actually. Exile X target creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller puts a 2/2 token onto the field. I think that this card in general is great in EDH because there are so many good cards on the field that if you replace them with 2/2 boars, which, you know, obviously everybody has increased life total, 2/2 token doesn't really do that much. So this card in general is pretty good. And Cyclonic Rift is possibly the best board wipe in the entire format. Return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand for 7 mana is insane. And this card is seen pretty much ubiquitously, so I don't know that I need to explain it. Let's see, finishers and counter spells. All right, we went over everything. So that is my 1/1 counter deck. I actually had a really tough time cutting this deck down to 100 cards. And you can sort of see that my maybe board was posted all the way down here. These are all the cards that were in the deck at some point that I cut. Things like Lighthouse Chronologist would have been amazing. And just a lot of these cards actually would have been amazing. But again, if you find yourself needing more counters, try out these cards right here. Otherwise, there are tons of other options if you feel like, for example, if you feel really strongly that Illusory Ambusher, for example, should not be in the deck, well, here's a ton of other really synergizing options to go ahead and include instead. Things like Rhystic Study. All right, so that's the deck. Once again, guys, thank you all for watching. Feel free to subscribe. I would really appreciate that. Feel free to leave a like on the video and all of that really fun stuff. So this has been They Can't Handle These Counters by Salted Productions, me, and I feel like I'm dragging out this outro way too long. All right, that's the video, guys. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.